Today, we are talking mostly about the whole story, but we're also talking about our experience at Slamdance 2025, which just relocated to LA.
We will be interviewing the director of the whole story.
I spent, like 12 or 13 years on this movie, but in the span of 22 hours, shot most of the last third of the film.
Oh my gosh.
That's crazy. Hello, and welcome back to Queer Cinema Catchup. I'm Joe.
And I'm Allison.
And so before we went to Slamdance, I got a pass to see some movies. So Allison and I were picking the movies that we were going to see ahead of time. There was a bit of a miscommunication. We signed up for a Friday night to see a 9:00 screening of a documentary called The Big Johnson.
It was an hour and a half before, and we were walking
to
somewhere.
Lazy Acres.
The point is that we were walking. I checked my email. I had no ticket for The Big Johnson, so Joe had to go to this 10 p.m. movie alone.
It was a really good documentary about the life of Dean Johnson, who was a drag performer in New York City in the 80s. Mm-hmm. He is just very masculine presenting that would wear dresses, but not alter his voice at all. They also handed out cool sunglasses.
Oh my gosh.
So yeah, he would wear this as part of his costume when he'd perform. And I'm pretty sure he went by he, him, even when he was in drag.
Oh, okay.
I could be wrong.
Dean Johnson was an American entertainer. He was a cross-dressing musician, party promoter, and prominent figure in the nightlife scene of New York City in the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s. Johnson played a seminal role in the emergence of the queer-core gay rock and roll subculture in the East Village.
The first band was called Dean Johnson and the Weenies, and there's this song called Fuck You that basically put them on the map. I think there was some MTV documentary being made that featured Dean Johnson and the Weenies. What was unique about him too is he's gay, he's queer, but he was really into punk rock, and I think that was kind of unusual. Usually it was more disco and heavy pop.
Queerness really should be kind of countercultural because it is saying the way we're supposed to be isn't the way we have to be, and that's very punk, very rock and roll.
And his lyricism, I feel like he'd really appreciate in his songwriting, because he'd find a way, with every new lyric, you go A, B, A, but he'd find ways to just make the beat different, or the way he'd pronounce words.
Yeah.
And the Fuck You song, what's so funny is he's saying basically fuck the government, fuck the, all these things.
Yeah.
And then he also goes, and fuck Mary Tyler Moore. It's why target Mary Tyler Moore? But he got signed to Island Records and then found out that he had HIV either the night that his band got signed or not long after that. And he got really into drug addiction and kind of just lost his way. The label wanted to change his image, wanted to change the band, and he didn't want to do that, and so they ended up dropping him. Towards the late 90s, early 2000s, he recommitted to music. He was still participating in sex work, and I think it was in 2007 or 2008, he ended up meeting a man. There was prescription drugs involved, and he ended up overdosing and dying. And 6 or 7 days prior, another man had died the same way in this man's apartment. And what was so amazing about this experience at Slamdance is they would have talkbacks, and the producer/director, she went up and actually brought up Dean Johnson's sister, who was in the documentary a lot too. It was really funny just because Dean Johnson's sister's very shy, very introverted. And so she didn't talk very much. And then the producer's just very gregarious and chatty and just very engaging. But it was really great that she brought in Dean's sister, and they kind of turned it into discussing, the producer discussed how much of a struggle it was while she was making the documentary. She contacted the police, was trying to get more information of what was going on with this guy that could have possibly killed Dean Johnson and why they weren't pursuing it. And she just didn't get any answers. And people in the audience were just really concerned and wanted to find a way to help. So that was it was a really cool experience.
I find that really inspiring because I don't think that's I've never seen that happen in real time. I feel like you watch something that's stirring or has a call to action or tells about a story that doesn't have a resolution, and you might feel compelled to do something or to investigate yourself, but you don't really do anything. So to be in a room where everyone kind of collectively feels the outrage at once sounds very inspirational.
There's a lot of penis in this movie, a lot of flash, and a lot of heavily sexual content. Heavily sexual content. But they had access to Dean Johnson, had written a lot of diaries or journal entries.
I see.
The producer really wanted to find someone who could emulate his voice, and he had a very deep voice that was kind of flat, kind of monotone in a way.
Yeah.
And she just couldn't find anyone that could replicate the voice very well. And so they ended up having one of the band members read the journal entries instead. And I thought she did a really good job. And then they hired an animator and they animated a lot of the stuff that he described. It was a really good documentary.
And what was it called again?
The Big Johnson.
Okay, check it out.
After his giant penis. Oh, and the producer also said, another aside that she talked about, is that she didn't know what to call the documentary. And she had a dream one night and Dean Johnson appeared to her in the dream and said, you should call the documentary The Big Johnson. I believe that in a way, he really did reach out to her in her dreams.
I like that.
And so that was my introduction to Slamdance 2025, is just being in this like really small intimate room that we went into a few times. And I really liked it. The movie was played on like almost like a school projector, I'd describe it. But the ambiance just felt really, I don't know, like welcoming and like not.
It wasn't pretentious.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Yeah, I think that's what I thought was cool about Slamdance in general. It both felt like a place to network, a place to be seen, a place to see young filmmakers in action, but also it felt very accessible.
Then it was Saturday, and
That's when we saw the whole story.
yes, and before that we saw Confessional. Chin Chin also.
Oh yeah. It was a Spanish
It
film.
was really fun. Before we entered, we had to write a secret
I did not.
before we went in.
I did not like this.
I won't share what we said, and I won't share what other people said. That's for us and the people in the room. But it was like it was like a fun little gimmick to do.
The film was about, a night in Spain, a group of friends, everybody has a secret. And it was sort of a slice of life, like what happens when people talk about their secrets and how are they connected, how are they not connected. And it kind of followed different characters that were all loosely tied to the same group of people. And there was definitely like a surreal humor to it that I quite appreciated. Cinema verite kind of style, which was fun. But yeah, during the talkback, the director and the producer, who were husband and wife, I believe, they pulled everybody's secrets into a hat that we had like written down. And if you wrote down a secret in line, you got a hat. And then they started reading them. And what I found very uncomfortable about it was I just didn't really want to hear my own secret because I just kind of made it up. You know what I mean? I just felt like really uncomfortable. I'm like, well, they're just going to pull a few. It's unlikely they'll read mine. But people like loved hearing the secrets. So they just kept going.
And I was
like, oh my gosh, please stop. But it made me feel really uncomfortable.
And then that evening, we watched the whole story. And oh boy, oh man, we were back in the room that I saw the Big Johnson in, because Chin Chin Confessionals was like in was in a much bigger movie theater. And so I felt this small room was very fitting for the whole story. We didn't know how. We kind of just went through log lines when we were picking movies, and I'm so happy that we picked this one.
Well, the log line was very simple. It was just, a big hole appears in Mount Shasta in California, and it's a mystery as to why it's there, and the truth is stranger than fiction was basically what it said.
Can we just walk through this whole movie, because it's just so...
Well, I think it'd be fun to do it like we could describe the structure of it.
Okay.
So I would say part 1, discovering the hole, setting up the mystery of the hole.
The movie starts and it seems very serious, and there's just like this piano music that would play like, da, na, 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 na. I don't know if that's any of the notes, but I'm like taking it face value and be like, oh, this is very like serious and concerning
film, because the logline makes you think it's connected to a crime,
right?
Which it is, because you're not allowed to just go onto protected federal land and dig holes.
Yeah, I didn't know if it was going to lead to like a murder.
I guess that's probably what I thought as well.
Yeah. And so, like, the title says there's just this hole.
And it's 63 feet deep, everybody.
And basically, nobody knows how it got there. And it becomes a little bit of an attraction.
People are investigating.
And then the forestry is concerned that someone's going to fall in and get injured.
So they fill it in.
Watching that excavator filling in that hole, it took it no time.
One of the forestry people just say it's funny. It probably took so long to dig that hole. But just in one afternoon, they just filled it back in again as if it never existed. And in part 1, it felt like Twin Peaks in a way, where it kind of became humorous.
Yes.
I would have loved to gone into that hole and mapped the geologic strata, but we weren't allowed to go into any sort of hole over 6 feet deep unless the walls were shored.
So, yes, it feels very sinister, and it's becoming such a serious situation with a lot of gravity and mystery and sinister feelings, but it is just like a hole in the woods. And so there's something kind of comical about that disconnect and the way everyone's sort of operating around it. But I feel like that is kind of the point of the movie, is that this hole, what you read into it, what other people read into this place, Mount Shasta, is very influential in how you interpret the events of the film. And I find that to be excellent.
And so part one, I was wondering, I was like, how is this movie going to be a feature length? Did we
'cause
actually stumble into like a short film?
Yeah, because it's like a whole. You're like, okay, well, if they don't know who did it and there's nothing more complicated here, what is the story? And I would say the end of part one hints, because they introduce two characters. And by character, these are real people. I'm just using that as a way to help orient us. William Messy, who was a historian, and Dustin Nafe, who's a local author. The two of them begin to give you some greater context into the place and the community of Mount Shasta and the history of Mount Shasta. And then that's what ushers us into part two. But before I label part two, we should talk a little bit about what those two guys kind of tell us about this place.
So I think the author brings up lemurs in India. And people believe that there's a tunnel from India to Mount Shasta. And the lemurs can go that way.
Yes. There's this book by a zoologist who examined the fossil record and saw some of the same lemurs who are from India seem to have been found in this area, leading people to believe there's this lost continent or a lost like continental bridge that they now believe is inside of the mountain, and that there are, or at least were, people called Lumerians living inside of the mountain. To give you some further context, there's some kind of eugenic Nazi undercurrent to this, where they're a special race of people, blonde, tall.
And not only that, but they were actually the ones native to Mount Shasta. So not only are you tying these eugenics, but you're also saying, and they were also here first.
Yes. So it's sort of a way to claim the area. But in addition to this Lumerian theory, there are a lot of like legends and myths associated with Mount Shasta that people then grab onto, and people will come to this area for mystical experiences. And there are groups they're willing to profit off of this.
Yeah. And so they introduce these Lemurians and their beliefs. And then that ushers us into part two, where it's like, holy shit, just goes beyond a hole in the ground. Could this be connected to someone believe something? And that's why the hole was dug. And so then it kind of gets your mind activated, and it's like, what could happen? And then part two introduces two of my favorite characters.
Part two
is golden.
Impeccable. We meet Arthur Aday.
Arthur Aday is my favorite character.
And Stefan.
I think it's Stefan
Sidani.
So describe Stefan. I want you to describe Arthur.
Okay. Stefan has a lot of confidence.
Yes.
An air of authority.
Wearing a suit.
And Arthur Aday is a hippie, long hair, kind of a turtle from Finding Nemo vibe about him.
And he has
a talk show,
but it's like a Mount Shasta public TV.
To make a long story short, though one of these people, Arthur Aday, seems like a crazy conspiracy man, the other seems like a very proper, refined individual. In reality, their functions in this film are reversed. Stefan is a man who believes in all the conspiracy theories about Mount Shasta, turned up to try and find the passageway to Lemuria, and is convinced that he can find it. Arthur Aday has him on his talk show to ask him about this. He claims to have found the door into the mountain, et cetera, et cetera. And as the movie continues to reveal that he's actually a giant conspiracy theorist.
Because we're introduced with Stefan. Stefan is introduced talking about the assassination of JFK. It's kind of like sets the stage, because there's a lot of conspiracy theories around what happened, who killed JFK.
Yes.
So it's kind of like, oh, he is very into conspiracies.
But it's not even that he's into conspiracies. He's into the truth.
Yeah.
Because he doesn't see it as a conspiracy. He sees it as him knowing or having access to information that is real, that everybody else is too blind to look at. Fantastic person to explore on the screen. You do, as the movie goes on, feel that he might not be mentally well, right. I would say.
And I think we're seeing a lot of B-roll of this local TV footage, probably from like 20 years ago. And Arthur and Stefan are much younger. And Stefan especially is like much healthier looking. And then when we cut to present day, Stefan, he has like dye in his hair. He's very like sweaty.
Well, he has a YouTube channel, and they show you the sort of videos he's posting, and it's like dangerous conspiracy theories, things that I don't really feel like I would like to repeat on a podcast. So there is something about him that you feel bad for him, because you just don't feel like he's in touch with reality, but you also see how that kind of belief system and conviction in your own sense of correctness can be dangerous too.
Right. But it's bounced off of Arthur. We're really with him for the most part, and his reaction to Stefan is just so funny. And And Arthur, I can't even mimic, because you described like the turtle from Finding Nemo as a good, kind of like a California surfer, but there's something, his like inflection and delivery makes it seems like he is kind of, that Arthur himself is kind of kooky and out there, but he's actually really sharp and really witty. And his like delivery seems to be like, he's confused, but then he'll pack it with like this hilarious punchline.
Steve and Sidoni came from New York. The other guys who dug the hole, hard telling where they came from. Come to find out, weren't they both there at the same time? Yeah, they were.
Arthur also kind of implies that Stefan is there at the same time that the hole was there. And then they actually go together to look at the doors. And this was the most hilarious part of the film, I thought, where they're cutting between Arthur, Stefan, and this other woman, Diane, who I do want to ask Elijah about because I wasn't clear on who she was, but she was the author of a book, Telos, and she said she was interviewed being like, the way to get to Telos is to read my book. And I couldn't tell if she was like, I'm a fiction writer and I want people to explore this world via the book, or if she really...
I think she believed it. In a traditional documentary, everyone's just like sitting down, getting interviewed and like talking like, this is what I believe. But with this woman, they introduce her and she's pacing around her living room. And so it's like already a little like unset. You're like, what is she doing?
So,
they cut to YouTube video of her. I think it's just to land that in Mount Shasta, there's not just this belief of Lemurians. There's like these other conspiracy theories.
So they're cutting between these three people who are kind of like spinning you up as an audience member. And they're talking about how Stefan had like connected with the cult who led him in the back way, but he wasn't really supposed to go that way according to Diane. And that's not good for him. And I think he made a mistake is what she said. Made a mistake. And then you got Arthur being like, we go up through this past the gazebo along the trail and it's really high up, and I go, maybe this man's gonna throw me off the trail. And then we get to the little door,
and then he goes, there they are, the two doors. And I was like, okay, so they're locked? And he goes, yep. I go, but how do you know that they're the two doors that go anywhere? He goes, I just know, I was told. And I go, yeah, I've been told things too. This is one of them I'm starting to wonder about.
And so you're getting spun up and you're getting all these different like perspectives that are all a little crazy. And then they cut back to the author who just goes, oh yeah, that door. I know about the door. That's the water supply of the city of Dunsmuir.
And it was like the perfect punchline. Like the landing of the way it was like cut, it was so hilarious. Like that was probably the biggest laugh.
And it is weird that there's a door in the side of the mountain, you know what I mean? And
but then there's like a perfect explanation.
And then with Stefan, I came away thinking two things. Like, doesn't seem in touch with reality.
No.
But at the same time, there's a suggestion. He said he wanted to write a screenplay. That when he heard about the Lemurians, that's why he came there. He goes on this talk show. He says things like, when there's two sides of the story, you have to verify and figure out the truth for yourself. Is there something more manipulative going on here than just this man really believes his own nonsense? Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? I couldn't tell if he was someone to feel bad for or someone who was stirring the pot on purpose, or a little bit of both. And I think the documentary left that up to the viewer.
Yeah, what I think was really hidden is he arrived there around the same time the hole appeared,
yes.
And the documentary doesn't want to push it and really question him at all.
Yes.
In fact, they kind of strangely avoid having him discuss the hole at all.
That's a good point.
They really focus on they focus on his beliefs and why he's out there.
Yes. I think he really believes it, but then at the end, his last quote was something like, people don't like the truth because then they have to deal with reality. Santa Claus, the boogeyman. And I'll leave it at that.
You did say you were really confused by that.
Because the things that he's talking about feel like Santa Claus or the boogeyman, a story, a myth. And that quote, and I'll leave it at that, implies that maybe he does know what he's saying and that he is leaning into this personality to attract views and attention. But then in listening to him, he does seem like a little untethered. It's just interesting. It's just a very complicated, a fascinating character to build part of a documentary around, I think. Mm-hmm. He also says this, there's two sides to every story, and then there's the truth. The truth usually lies somewhere in the middle. That's what he tells Arthur Ardé. In the present, he says, Agatha Christie, Steven Spielberg, maybe they are available to help us write the ending to the story. Maybe Jimmy Hoffa is buried there. Let's just ask Jimmy. Get someone up here to channel Jimmy. So it seems like he's like making fun of the fact that there's this grand mystery, even though he went there, he was in the local paper, he was drawing up interest in these mysterious Lemurians. Did he believe it, or was he just trying to be famous? You know what I mean? I don't know.
Yeah.
And now is it the same? It's just like a very interesting.
That's interesting because we were talking about how Arthur Day says things but means another thing, and it's very like he like is bringing the audience in with him and being like, this is kind of
like laughing
ridiculous,
at him
isn't it?
in a charming, lovely way. Yes.
And while we say there's a contrast between the two, but maybe they're more similar than we even realize.
Yeah.
With Stefan, could it be that he's pulling our leg and not letting us in on the joke?
Yes.
And then with these last few quotes, he's giving us breadcrumbs
to be like, wink, the boogeyman. But then if that's the case, then I'm even more disturbed by him because the things that were on his YouTube channel were abhorrent.
That's what
abhorrent.
Yes,
like that it made me like recoil and made me like dislike. I was like, I've been laughing and now I feel like a horrible person for laughing at this man and being and like finding Mary in this figure because he's like got these beliefs that are just so disturbing to me.
Yeah. So why would he make a whole YouTube channel?
For the clicks. But then also maybe he really believes him. I don't know.
I don't think there were many clicks.
Well, he said he got hundreds of millions of views. I don't know. I'm so curious to hear more about him with Elijah. But that was part 2. Mm-hmm. And then we get to part 3, which is the closest we're going to get to the truth for the whole story.
And I just got like shivers.
I know.
But it's like without this specific character, we would just be like shrouded in way too much mystery. But then this really sells it. And it's like, first the question is, what is this whole, how to get it here? Who's responsible for it? In part 1. Then part 2 introduces these conspiracies, the mystery of Mount Shasta. You're like, oh my, this is this huge thing. You kind of forget all about the hole.
Yeah.
And then part 3 is like, oh, remember the hole from part 1? Are you kind of curious how that connects all of it?
Well, they seem to be suggesting that maybe it was Stefan who was digging it.
Because the belief is they're going to dig their way down
to get to the people in the mountain. But instead, we get Brett Grimes.
This is a story I have been telling over beers for like 13 years now.
Also an excellent person to put in a documentary. And we heard a little bit in the talk back that basically Elijah had been working on this movie, I think he said for 6 years.
I thought like 12 years.
But basically what ended up happening was he was shaping it, and close to maybe the end, someone had reached out from like a Berkeley public radio course or something like that and said, can I interview you about this movie that you're making? And he said yes, and ended up getting broadcast for a wider audience. And somebody sent this piece of information to this young man, Brett Grimes, which was crucial to the rest of the movie because who is Brett Grimes?
Brett Grimes was one of the people involved with digging the hole.
And I did not think we would get so close to the truth. So it was fantastic. And that's why this documentary is constructed so well, because it's sort of like sketching this place, exploring the strangeness of it and the strange people connected to it. There could have been a 3rd chapter that kind of summed it up in a more ambiguous way. And I think that would have been satisfying. But instead it's like, and here's the truth, which is a little bit darker.
Yeah.
And more mysterious than you think it could even be.
It kind of speaks to what we like in entertainment. We like mystery. We like it getting weird.
Yep.
And then we like getting answers. But those answers actually lead to more questions and mystery that we didn't even know beforehand.
That's why we love Severance.
So Brett gets introduced. He just says that he was like really strapped for cash. He was 19 years old. He was on MSN Messenger. Saw that someone was looking for people to build a fence. He reached out and almost immediately got a response. Be like, hey, can you do this? We need you here tomorrow at such place. Is that where he goes to the hotel? Meets a guy and he's really excited. He's 19 years old. He said he used the last of his money to pay for the gas to get to the hotel. Also, Brett is an incredible storyteller.
He is, and he has an extreme emotional intelligence. Like he just talked about people and relationships in a way where you could tell he was really highly emotionally intelligent.
Yeah. But yeah, he goes to this hotel using the last of his money, 19 years old, really young. And he's really excited because I forget how much he's getting paid, but he gets to stay at a hotel he gets his own room.
He gets a per diem.
I'm saying hotel, but I think it's a motel.
Yeah.
And then he gets a per diem.
He gets to bond with these, he's 20, these older guys in their late 30s. Yeah. And they kind of really take him under their wing. They're like, you're the guy. You know, there's like mentorship there that's happening.
Yeah. And so they go on the first day, they go up to this
to the mountain.
To this mountain. And then they're like, oh, why are you here? He's like, well, yeah, we're building a fence, right? And then one of the guys is like, oh, that's what he told you. I was told we were going to be like putting gravel to make sidewalks, something like that. Like they all were told different things, but they're all brought there to dig this hole. And I wonder how long they had been digging beforehand. I forget how deep it was because he was brought on because they probably need to dig in faster. Nobody knows why they're digging. Nobody's really asking questions. Do they have a name for the guy?
Joseph.
Joseph is described as wearing a suit.
Yes, which is interesting because it is a tie back to Stefan. I know we were saying that in our second watch, but then in listening to Brett's story, I don't get the sense it was the same guy because I also think to be in charge of a large group of people, Stefan doesn't strike me as the kind of man who could do that. You know what I mean? And I guess just to like kind of describe this in a quick way, Brett at first is like really into it and thinks this is great, doesn't see anything like strange about it. But then as time goes on and the guy starts saying like, well, what happens when we find it? Are they going to like push us in the hole? What are we looking for? Maybe we should stash some guns up here. He's starting to sense the danger. And then he goes home for a break and he's describing it to a friend, and a woman from up above in the apartment above like comes running down and hands him a book about the Lemurians.
So there were a few times where Brett would always be like, and I'd be having some beers with my friends, telling the story. Nobody really believes me. He's like, this one time I was at this apartment complex telling my friends, and the unit above, we heard someone go, oh. And he's like, and then we heard them stomping and running down the stairs, and then
give them the book, and then he kind of realizes,
she's like, this is what it's all about. This is what you're digging for.
It's like tied to a religion, like this like idea about.
Was it the Lemurians or was it something different?
I think it's the I Am cult or like a different cult associated with the idea that there are these people in the mountains and there's like this holy branch or something like that they're maybe looking for. Showing that there are all of these people connected to it who have different stories reinforces that this is a mystery and that doesn't have an answer.
I was at the hotel, it was late at night, and it was Joseph. No, it might not have been Joseph, it might have been the crew lead. Gave me a phone call, and it was like, you've got the truck. This is the deal. Joseph will pay you $200 tonight if you get in your truck with one guy. Being motivated for $200 to do that, it was stupid, but it was the end. I knew it. When I got that phone call, that was it.
Brett's last hurrah. It did a really good job building up that this could be, not only was it strange, but it could be dangerous.
Yes.
And he didn't know if he could be killed. They went up and go and load for hours.
All night.
Material.
Until the truck's full.
To his car.
Yeah.
What the real puncher of it is he's like, they'll pay you $200 if you go up there tonight. And he like tells this whole intense story. He's like, it was so crazy. And we drive back and then I say goodbye knowing I never see them again. And then I go home and realize I never got the $200. Then kind of describing like what it is probably to be in a cult or to be so deep into your beliefs or conspiracies.
Or even just being in the wrong place at the wrong time and getting swept up in it.
Yeah. After that event, he like offloaded for a week. Mm-hmm. And then he just kind of realized how insane it was. And that's when he called his dad. And his dad was like, you cannot be so naive. And it was really kind of like a coming of age moment.
Once you're out of that mindset, you're not around those people, then you start realizing like, what were we really doing? What did we find? What did I let someone talk me into? I wish I could have known more.
Even today, this sense of like confusion about what actually happened to him and what he was involved in has stuck with him. Even though he's been telling the story over beers and it's been a kind of a comical thing, he just came across as so haunted to me still. So haunted that when he heard someone was making a documentary about this, he had to reach out because he just needed to unload this information and like have somebody help him put it into context. It just sounded so traumatizing, and I feel like not knowing is kind of what this documentary is about and how it can make people respond very differently. So you have someone like Carmen, the Forest Service woman, who's like, I did my job, I found out what I could, and then I washed my hands of it. I was okay with that. And then you have someone like Brett, who is just haunted and confused and unsure where to put all of these feelings about it and the sense of danger of what could have happened, what didn't happen, what almost happened. Mm-hmm. And then you have people like Stefan who like come in and fill in the blanks, and maybe they believe it, maybe they don't, maybe they're manipulating you, maybe they've lost their minds. And I just think it's like a litmus test for how we all respond to the fact that we live in a world that is mysterious, that we can use science, we can use religion, we can use all these things to kind of strive for certainty, but in reality, there is no certainty. And that is terrifying.
And this movie uses the B-roll footage, but then mirrors the image. So then it looks like a Rorschach test. And just like what you're speaking to, the mystery of all, and like the real themes of this movie is like you can look at something and see something completely different from somebody else.
Yes.
The movie is just like so much bigger than just about a hole. And that's what makes it so
excellent. Good. And I think like another good way to sum it up is they go back to the historian or the novelist, I can't remember who, and they talk about where the Lemurian mystery came from.
This book is where it all began.
and it was written by H. Spencer Lewis in 1931. But in 1936, he published an article called The Great Master Hoax. And in it, he writes, "But we never suspected that sane men and women would believe 1/10 of the foolish, fantastic, extremely improbable stories issued for the purpose of leading men and women into the foothills of Mount Shasta."
People create stories or point out mysteries, and then human beings react to it. And they either create more mystery, more misery, or they're left feeling haunted or whatever it might be. And
and so
it's fascinating.
People like look at something, and then even when there's like evidence to the contrary, and I think they kind of did that with Stefan too, is then it's like, oh, because you're saying this, it makes what I believe even more true because you're trying to tell me something else, but you're hiding the truth from me.
The unfortunate part is, like, of course, every so often there are conspiracy theories that are true. There's cover-ups, about like a toxin spilled and the company tries to deny it, whatever it might be. Like, those things happen. And so having some skepticism, some doubt about the world is good. But if you go too far down that path, it's like there's a line between.
Right.
Yeah, you got to have some tether to what's real, what's not.
Yeah. And we've talked about it on other episodes, especially with Severance, is like we're always looking for patterns. Like we're always like looking for something, and then it's like really exciting. It's really thrilling. And sometimes it can make some of our, at times, mundane lives feel that much more interesting and give more to life itself.
And I think TV is a great example, like narrative TV, the mystery box, the Easter egging, like all of that. It's like a good place for humans to use, because I think it's just such a natural pattern seeking part of the human brain.
Mm-hmm.
And so using television as a way to kind of exercise that part of your brain is fun and better than maybe trying to do it in reality.
Yeah.
Now we are going to speak to Elijah Sullivan about the process of creating this documentary and just get a little bit more insight into the whole story.
We saw your movie at Slamdance, loved it, and we're in awe of your documentary. So,
oh, that's really kind of you.
We're very happy that we could just basically, as fans, follow up with questions that we have about the
we should just ask, why not?
Sure, you got me. Yeah, let's do it. Yeah,
maybe just get started. I'd love to hear a little bit about your background and how you got interested in filmmaking.
I was always an arty kid. I liked drawing, and then I started writing, and then I think around maybe 12 or something like that, my friend group at that time, they already liked making little movies with their like parents' camcorder and, dressing up in, growing up in Mount Shasta, which is a tiny little town. I think it's 3,500 people or something like that. It's hard to get a crew or a cast or anything together to do something. Mm-hmm. I was in college, studied journalism a little bit in 2012. So I was 27 at the time. I heard this story for the first time about the hole on Mount Shasta, which had happened while I was away at college. So I didn't hear about it till 3 years after it happened.
Okay.
And I went, this would make a good newspaper article.
Okay.
Somebody else said, you should make a documentary about it.
Mm-hmm.
And other people had made documentaries about Mount Shasta, or, usually it was like, Mount Shasta has been featured a lot on TV shows like Ancient Aliens and things like that. And that was kind of most of the representation of Mount Shasta. Those are fun show. But like that was kind of the main depiction of it that you would see. And I thought, somebody's going to make a documentary about this someday, and they're going to mess it up. I'm going to be so annoyed, and I'm going to be so jealous. So And as I was thinking about it, I just got like this jolt of energy and just like got up out of bed, like, make a movie. And I just like started, I don't even know what I sat down to do. I probably sat down and wrote some emails or something like that. And just not really knowing what I was doing, just started. And now I'm 40.
And I wouldn't have guessed that you kind of came at it from a journalism angle.
Yeah, it was, kind of, I think, super silly in hindsight that, I had wanted to be a filmmaker my whole life, and somebody else had to give me the idea to do this. And it became this thing that I was just deeply passionate and, frankly, pretty obsessed with. I got obsessed.
Who was the first person you interviewed for the documentary?
Peter Van Susteren. He was one of the Forest Service employees. One of the first guys on the scene.
like we loved the subjects of the documentary and
Yes.
sort of how they're presented without much, I guess, authorial, is that the right word? Commentary. And then you kind of have to react and judge their stories for yourself as a viewer. And I really appreciate that with the themes of the film. How do you go about approaching an interview for a documentary? And how were you thinking about it in terms of the story you were telling and the themes of the story?
Yeah, I think I'm really glad you noticed that. Thank you. That there was kind of two aspects to that where I knew I was going to be my own editor, and I don't like looking at my own face or hearing my own voice. So I was never going to put myself in the movie. I have like 1 foot in and 1 foot out of Mount Shasta since I moved here when I was 6.
Okay.
And I kind of still remember that feeling of being new here and kind of being a little disoriented with how different the culture was versus, I'm from the East Coast. They're just perfectly normal people and you're having these everyday conversations. And then at some point, you don't really notice where it kind of veers off the normal path and they start talking about UFOs or talking to fairies or having inner experiences talking to ascended masters from India in their meditations as if it's completely normal. And then the other person will respond as though that's normal and share their experience. And you're kind of go, wait, that's normal? That's never happened to me. And then you kind of learn, not to laugh, like not to judge, and that's kind of normal to them. Like you kind of learn the cultural norms. You can kind of try to have like that anthropological distance of like, oh yeah, this is just a different culture. This is normal to them. And then of course it really eventually, I integrated for the most part.
Yeah.
And so I tried to take that with me into the interviews, that feeling of sitting in somebody's living room and they're telling you a story, and wherever that story takes you, you just like give them your full attention. And I'm usually sitting, usually the first stretch of the interview is the best part. I ask them, who they are, how they came to Mount Shasta, and how they first heard about the hole, maybe something like that, and let them go. And usually they will talk for 20 or 30 minutes without very much prompting. I just sit behind the camera. I like to sit close to the camera so that we have a tight eye line of like where they're almost looking into the camera, but not quite, and sit fairly close to them so that it feels intimate. They don't have to yell across a room, with a bunch of lights around them. I also don't like to do a lot of lighting.
Yeah, if you're speaking with people whose job it is to maintain the mountain, and they know that this kind of mystical thinking exists within the community, how if you were to start with that might damage, like they'll probably still be polite to you and answer your questions, but it might it might change the nature of the conversation or the rapport between you. And that would never have occurred to me, but it makes a lot of sense.
You have these like cast of characters, like the way that you decided to, withhold some information when you were talking to some of the rangers, just so you are getting their interviews and just allowing them to just speak what comes to their mind on the subject, I think is like really interesting. And I want to jump into some of Allison and my just like favorite characters in this movie. And specifically, we were most like fascinated with Arthur Adair and Stephen Sindoni.
Yeah.
I really responded to when you meet Arthur Adair, the character or the subject in the film. He runs a talk show. He's kind of got a quirky look to him. He has an interesting intonation, and it's come after we've learned a lot about Lemuria and the spiritual tourism of Mount Shasta. So I feel like you're primed to see him as as an example of this sort of person, or maybe even a leader in the community. But then he's actually incredibly, as he's speaking, and that you start to realize how sharp he is. And then you're learning that in relationship to, is it Stefan or Steven Sidoni?
Oh, he goes by both. It's confusing. Yeah. It gets confusing. The other day he called himself Steven. I was like, further confused.
But yeah, it's like you learn in putting them side by side, and then with the archival footage you have of Stefan appearing on Arthur's show, seeing them interact together, you sort of realize that it's actually topsy-turvy, and Arthur is very sharp and in control, and Stefan maybe is not, although I also have questions about how Stefan appears both as lost in the conspiracy, but also maybe taking advantage of the conspiracies out in the world. And so there's like an interesting dichotomy there too. But yes, I just really loved how you structured that part of the film to teach us about those subjects via their dynamic in a surprising way. And I was just curious how you did that, or how, if that was a conscious decision, or just how you kind of utilized those two subjects in the film specifically.
Yeah, no, definitely. I definitely saw Stephen and Arthur as being, I mean, maybe not the people that the community would want to represent them, but they are very archetypal in a way. And not hopefully a stereotype, but like an archetype.
Okay.
Where I didn't want to treat them as one-dimensional cartoonish characters, but they contained a lot of complexity and a lot of sort of universal qualities that, for example, if we wanted to get a little bit of a glimpse into, Stephen's presented as a sort of person of interest in the investigation, and whether or not he turns out to be the person who dug the hole, his mentality must not be too far off from the person who did do it, right? That you have to be pretty excited about something to dig a hole that deep. And Stephen, and it's probably not a coincidence that they chose to dig it on Mount Shasta.
Right.
And Stephen's one of those characters who was so close to that, and so excited about that he did something so adjacent to it that he became a person of interest. Gosh, there's so many things.
Who did you discover first, Stephen or Arthur?
I think I discovered Stephen first. I think Stephen was introduced to me by my friend George while we were in the research phase. And he said, hey, you should take a look at this guy that makes all these YouTube videos about Mount Shasta. And I started watching the YouTube videos about Mount Shasta, and I said, George, I noticed that he was in town around the time that the hole was dug. And he was like, oh, come on, you're so paranoid. How could you accuse him of something like that? He was starting to get really mad at me. I'm like, I don't know. Like, he showed up at the beginning of the summer when the hole started being dug, and he left town in a paranoid, mental state around the time that the hole was filled in. In one of his videos, he alluded to something like the Forest Service burying the truth with bulldozers. And I went, I don't know, man. I'm kind of wondering if he at least knew something. But then Stephen did this interview on Coast to Coast AM with George Noory, where he went on about a 1-minute rant about, apropos of nothing, just of his own volition, started talking about how when he was in Mount Shasta, the consequences of having a high profile and digging for the truth, because when I was in Mount Shasta, they thought that I dug this hole and blah, blah, and he went on this whole thing about being investigated by the Forest Service and the FBI for digging a hole on Mount Shasta. I sent that to George, and I went, and he went, okay, all right, let's look into it. So it took me a while of messaging Stephen to kind of get him to talk. And at some point while doing that, he might have told me about Arthur, or somebody might have told me, like, somehow I found out about Arthur around the same time. And I think I actually interviewed Arthur first.
Okay.
And that interview is amazing. In fact, at one point while I was making this film, I said, I never made like a short documentary. Like, I never practiced before I jumped in and made a feature. So I actually made a 16-minute long documentary just about Arthur. I have a whole separate thing just about Arthur and his incredible life.
That's amazing.
And we're close still. He's been texting me all day today trying to figure out how he's going to get to the next film festival that's showing this movie. It's really wonderful because he keeps forgetting that he's seen it, and I get to show it to him again and get his reaction again. He's like, a movie about what? Because I've been making it so long, a couple of years will go by and it'll be like, a movie about what? I'm like, the hole in Mount Shasta.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, the hole in Mount Shasta. They think Stephen might have done that. And I'm like, I know, I interviewed you in the film. He's like, really? What did I say? So, come over and watch it again. So he's great, and
Oh my gosh.
he knows how to be funny too. He'll put on a crown and a cape and walk around with a scepter. He knows people laugh, so he leans into the clownishness, but he can turn it off too. Like he is a serious, sweet person on a lot of levels.
His comedic timing and like
It's
his
amazing.
line delivery is so like I've never experienced something like that before. And it was just like so it made me like laugh even harder just because it
Yes.
was again like appearance wise, like the way he talks, like the languages he uses, I wouldn't think he'd be so sharp, but he is.
And especially in a conversation, and you could really see that on the talk show where he'd say something and you'd kind of realize it seemed genuinely like shocked or elated, but there was like a bite to it beneath his words, but it wasn't too mean-spirited. And yeah, he has a real command of conversation that
Yes.
that's I think rare to come by.
Yeah, his talk show, A Day in Telos, was on for I think at least a decade. He did something like 400 episodes. He interviewed everybody in the Mount Shasta scene. He got really good at interviewing people in his own kooky way, like not in like a 60 Minutes kind of way, but he has his way with people, and he perfected his on-camera persona that he can switch on, and he loves it when you turn a camera on. He just talks 4 hours.
We definitely emerged fans. Like I would watch the show. I'm disappointed that he wasn't at our
Screening
at
at
our screening at Slamdance.
He wanted to be there. It was just, yeah.
So the movie, when it begins, there is like a sense of unease. You're talking about something very strange, like a hole appearing in the middle of a mountain, and you kind of think you're in for this ride that's going to be a mystery. It's going to be full of suspense, and it is, of course, all of that. But I forget how maybe like 10 minutes into the movie, something happened. Someone said something, and we laughed, and we realized, oh, this is going to be, a funny film too. Like there's this comedic edge to it, and I'm so curious. Did you always know that was going to be the case? And how did you kind of go about balancing or constructing the tone?
Yeah, the tone was really tricky, and one of the reasons why I cared about being the person to make the film, because on one end of the spectrum you have like what I would kind of call like maybe overly credulous people who sort of are like Bigfoot's eating people on Mount Shasta kind of movies. And a lot of the movie around like the last third of the movie, a lot of that's new.
Right.
And then a lot of the stuff before that is like the Forest Service. A lot of that was reshot. So in a way that even though that's the oldest part of the movie, it ended up being some of the newest too. So the Steven Sindoni section of the movie is maybe the part that I had the longest to shape just the same batch of footage over and over again over years.
Okay.
And I probably could have made I definitely could have made a feature film just about Steven. About his whole search for, he's probably going to be a little bit bummed that there isn't more in the film about his search for the J.C. Brown tunnel. There's so much that happened after he left Mount Shasta and he came back a couple times, further adventures that he had that just weren't very relevant to the whole. So unfortunately, a lot of that stuff had to go. But in compressing his story so much, I tried really hard to maintain nuance and complexity, because his personality contains a lot of extremes, and I didn't want him to come across as a cartoon.
Right.
One problem that happens when you compress things in a documentary is you might end up with just the most colorful stuff and you make everybody look crazy. Steven did a lot of stuff that is pretty out there. And as I tried to get his story down to, I think it's like 25 minutes or something like that, I tried really hard to make sure that people understood where he was coming from, what his motivations were, how he felt about things, and preserve as many different facets of him as I could. And like you said, those moments where sometimes like I introduce him as a person of interest, and then I kind of immediately abandon that and introduce him as somebody who's on an adventure and kind of make him a protagonist for his own story for a little while, kind of make people forget that he's a person of interest. And then just kind of keep rotating it to a different facet periodically.
Absolutely.
And ultimately, hopefully understand, like kind of get like a capsule experience of like the sort of, for lack of a better term, like the Mount Shasta pipeline. We spread these stories and we have this mythology, and it gets promoted a lot for tourism, and it draws a lot of people here. And for some people, the adventure just kind of stops at a camping trip or something like that, or going skiing. But for some people, like it goes all the way, it can go into some very strange places, and people can get a little lost. And I think Steven kind of encapsulated all of
Yeah.
that. Sometimes he's the one who's telling the story to build up his own fame and his own position, and then sometimes he's on the receiving end of feeling like he got duped by a bigger fish, or I feel so I thought he was a really fascinating person, and I just tried to keep as much of the complexity as possible. And he's also pretty funny, so I tried to keep his humor in there as well. I think the couple times that we like do laugh at him, I was I wasn't necessarily like, I remember at one of those screenings there was a really big laugh when they revealed what the doors to Lemuria were.
Yes, at Slamdance,
It was really funny.
We all laughed.
Yeah, and I was like, oh, I was actually I wasn't necessarily intending a laugh there. I just thought, like, the poor municipal workers who have to maintain those doors and keep having to increase the security on it because people keep trying to cut through them and blow them up and all these different things. I should include an unambiguous statement of what's actually there so that there's no copycat stuff and no more I don't accidentally encourage any more trespassing. But I see now, like, oh yeah, when we are just that definitive about that's not what those are, they're this. That is actually really funny.
The fact that it had such a concrete answer was what was funny to me.
Yeah.
With Steven, I definitely when his section concluded, I was like, I don't know what my takeaway is on Steven, because I feel like he seemed very complex. Where yes, he was a bit of an adventurer. He was a storyteller. He even mentioned that he wanted to write a screenplay, I think, at the beginning of his story. And then you kind of get the sense that what happened to him there kind of had him fall into these ideas, and how much is that kind of like, how much of is he a victim of that? You know what I mean too, where these kind of conspiracy thinking can really pull you down to a rabbit hole. Yeah, and then just even you ended with a quote like, people don't like the truth because then they have to deal with reality. Santa Claus, the boogeyman. I'll leave it at that.
Exactly.
And he definitely seemed like a complex figure to me.
That last line that Allison, that quote about like Santa Claus and all that, I'd be curious to hear like why you chose to end Steven's section with that quote and how you interpret it.
There was so much material with Steven. I could have ended it on many different notes. And I think part of it was just a time management thing of what's in and what's out, and I kind of realized kind of late in the game that maybe not everything that I was trying to communicate with that section of the movie was coming across. And I had shown that section, I had shown early edits of the movie to many people who kind of, some of them didn't even get why Steven was in the film. They're like, why are you even doing this? This is just kind of sad and creepy or something. I was like, oh man, then I really failed, because I think that there is a loneliness to Steven, and there's a little bit of a melancholy to it for sure. And I have concern for him at times, but I didn't, and he's definitely can be, he can come across kind of sketchy for sure. But I just really thought that if anybody came away from this movie judging people in the film like him in that way, that I had failed. So I kept combing through. I had like 10 or 12 hours of interviews with him, trying to find something that might give us a better insight into who he was so that people would understand and things would gel. And that monologue that he gave, he was definitely kind of hurt. To me, like the bitterness kind of tells you is kind of where the conclusion of his story kind of lies, which is that he had this amazing experience and kind of felt like he got kicked out of paradise at the end and came out of it pretty bitter and disillusioned. And I don't think he's the only person who's ever felt that way about Mount Shasta. It's kind of a dark moment in the story, or at least a sad moment in the story, but I felt like it was an important depiction of what happens sometimes in Mount Shasta. I do have a lot of positive things to say about Mount Shasta, but those have been covered very thoroughly. You might even say toxically positive, because it denies that there's any kind of dark side to anything, or that there's any, it kind of really denies the shadow. So if I leaned towards some of that and some of the other feelings that don't often get processed when people are telling stories about Mount Shasta. I kind of intentionally chose to go there.
I definitely felt that at the end of his story. And then I feel like that is so complemented by what comes next, which is the closest we'll get to the truth. And what really struck me about, I feel like you did an excellent job too with the emotional storytelling with Brett's narrative about being someone who was digging this hole. And the whole time that he was speaking and when his story concluded, I just kept thinking like he feels so haunted by this, even though he exudes like positive energy. Like he has like a very processed perspective on what happened, but just the way he kept bringing up how I don't really know what was going on there and this idea of what could have happened. He kept mentioning that, and I just felt this haunted energy, and that kind of is reminding me what you're saying, how this is an emotional story and it's looking at the darker side of what can happen in this place or with this kind of thinking or these kinds of adventures.
Are you still in touch with Brett? Like what's going on? Like tell us everything.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Brett, I mean, I guess I still had a decent movie without him, but he definitely brought it to the next level. And was what the movie needed at the end. And it's such a complete story. It's almost mythic in that way that like a good coming of age story is. And he waited, I think, about a year to reach out. And we did a little Zoom interview because he doesn't live in the state and I'm too cheap to travel. And I edited that into the film for a little while, but obviously that's less than ideal. But I became very familiar with his story. I watched it over and over and over again, edited it, figured out how I was going to compress it, which sound bites were important. And then one day I reached out to him and said, "Hey, are you ever going to come back? Because I think I'd like to reshoot this in person." And he said, "Oh, funny coincidence. Yeah, in like 3 weeks, I'm going to be traveling through." And he wasn't staying overnight. I only had him for part of the afternoon. And so a couple friends came over and we just had to set up a place in a corner of the house and have it all ready for when he showed up. And he sat down and I asked him to tell the story, and then I asked him the few follow-up questions that I needed because I knew which beats that it needed to hit, and we banged the whole thing out in I think an hour and a half.
That is unreal.
It's totally nuts. And then we went up on the mountain and filmed those few sort of, verite shots of him up on the mountain, and that took maybe another hour. And then from there, he dropped me off in his truck and took off back to Reading. I think the whole thing was 2.5 or 3 hours.
Wow.
And then I had already rented that hotel room that he stays at in the film because I thought maybe I'd interview him there, but it was too noisy. There's too much traffic. But I had already rented it, and I made this movie extremely frugally. I think it was under $1,000 altogether. And I was not going to waste the $130 that I spent on that hotel room. So I went after the interview with him. I went and shot all the stuff for the hotel room that night, and then in the morning shot the daytime stuff at the hotel. And I must have done a few hundred, or maybe not a few hundred, a couple hundred camera setups that day. So in the span of 20, I spent like 12 or 13 years on this movie, but in the span of 22 hours, shot most of the last third of the film.
You said you spent under $1,000 on this movie?
Yeah.
Oh my God, that's crazy.
It's basically in my backyard, like the hole is up the road from me.
Oh
it's basically a bunch of nature shots and people sitting in my house doing interviews.
Wow.
In fact, that movie it's almost a documentary about my house because I interviewed Steven Sindoni, like he was sitting like 2 feet away from where I am right now, in my bedroom. That's why he's filmed in darkness, so you can't see that it's my bedroom. Brett was filmed on the other end of the house. Carmen Kinch was filmed in my kitchen. Arthur Day was in my living room.
I guess that makes sense. I had no idea that you use so many locations at your own house to film these.
Those are kind of like my two big intentions with the film. Was I wanted to make the kind of movie about Mount Shasta that I wanted to see, and I also kind of wanted to prove to myself that it didn't matter if I ever became a big filmmaker or whatever. I could make a quality film for next to nothing and kind of not have to rely on raising tons of money and needing a huge crew and things like that. Because as long as you have to ask for permission, you're going to hear no a lot.
Yeah.
Like if I had known that this was going to take 12 years, would I still have done it? I think I might have been too daunted. I think that might
Yeah.
have been overwhelming. But the way that I was able to do it was, one step at a time, taking little bites, learning as I go, sometimes reshooting stuff over and over again. Like there are interviews in there that I had to ask for 7 years before they said yes.
Oh my God.
Wow.
And there are shots in the movie that took, like, there's one shot of a lenticular cloud in the movie. And I spent years, basically the entire time that the film was in production, I just had to keep an eye out to see if there was a lenticular cloud, and went out and just filmed them over and over and over and over and over again. And I have just hundreds of gigabytes of footage of the mountain, and until I just had the one that I wanted.
The cinematography looked incredible. That's why I'm so impressed by how it's such a low budget. Audie Carlisle's the other cinematographer. When did she get enveloped into this project?
Yeah. Audie's amazing. She's a friend of mine who has her own documentary web series called Shasta Stories, where she's made 20 something now short documentaries, short subjects about people and different aspects of Siskiyou County. And they're incredible. And I vibed with her right away, and I really liked her cinematography. She's a wonderful cinematographer.
Yeah, you were functioning and she was functioning as cinematographer. She just did a really seamless job in capturing your style, and I think it just was really beautifully done.
Yeah,
it looks great.
Yeah,
and then you function as the editor on this movie too. And as an editor myself, you said you have 12 hours of footage of Steven. Was a lot of footage left on the cutting room floor with a lot of your interviews, or did most of it make it into the movie?
It was all over the place. Somebody like Steven can, there's a lot of material there. There's a lot of stuff to cover. There's a lot of things that he wanted me to include. So there are a lot of stories he would tell, kind of hoping to excite me into including them. And there's some wonderful, wonderful stuff on the cutting room floor with him. Mm-hmm. Some people were shorter. I think Carmen Kinch, the investigating officer, she's such a straight shooter that I think even though she's one of the key, she's some of the glue that holds the story together. I think we only shot for 40 minutes.
Oh, wow.
Arthur, I have so much footage of Arthur.
We want to see that short film.
I do.
Yeah. I'll have to dust that off, and it needs a little bit of polish, but I'll have to dust that off because a few people have asked. He's a star. What can I say? There are a few of them in the film. I think Steven's very fascinating. Brett's a star.
Absolutely.
With all these interviews, everyone's sitting down. They're talking to you right beside the camera. Was it intentional to have Diane Robbins walking around the room? How did that come about?
Diane's at the moment that I met her, she needed to stand. I think she was in discomfort if she sat. So she wanted to stand. And then she kind of, I think, was maybe a little anxious about talking about Steven.
Yeah.
So no, I didn't. I wouldn't have chosen to do that. I would have liked to have filmed that in the same style as the rest. Although I think it was indicative. Her body language, you kind of know immediately that she feels pretty uneasy talking about this. And I feel bad putting her in that position. She was a very nice lady, but I guess it worked out in a way.
The way you cut between the three of them, the form matched the substance, I guess.
Yeah.
So even though it wasn't intentional, it really did work.
Yeah, there was basically no technique there. Yeah, I guess we really, I know I felt for her. I felt really bad. Every time I watched that interview, I used less and less and less of it in the film because I'm like, she doesn't want to be here. I feel bad.
Yeah, I mean, that as somebody who I consider myself to be kind of an empathetic person, I feel like that would be a very hard part about. I'm more of a fiction writer, you know what I mean? I just, in a documentary setting, I would have a hard time. So I really appreciate the fact that you do care so deeply. I think probably makes the film better because, they're real people, we're saying characters, but they are real human beings. So I think it's a good thing that you clearly care about their experience. And about my community too. And I think some people who make movies about Mount Shasta, they're kind of, interlopers and they don't have to see these people again, but I'll bump into them at the grocery store. Yeah. These are real people who are living their lives just like I am, trying to live my life in this town. And
I don't want to disturb anybody.
So what's next for the whole story? And then what's next for you as a filmmaker?
I'm planning to do some kind of self-release online, try and get it streaming, hopefully get it streaming by the end of the year,
Awesome.
because I think the locals in particular really want to see it.
Yeah.
I'm kind of eager to get it out there so that it sounds kind of vain or something like that, but I did want to contribute something to the conversation about Mount Shasta and get the conversation going.
Mm-hmm.
After this, I don't know if I'm ever going to find another story that had so many of the qualities that I was really looking for. I think
Yeah.
I'd always wanted to make a movie about Mount Shasta, but I never had like a through line to kind of connect all of this stuff together. And it was kind of the perfect story where, it starts as this mystery, and to explain the mystery, you have to explain all the things that I wanted to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
From the story you told about how you kind of found this story, maybe there's something there where it's kind of like the next story is going to find you, at some point in time.
I hope so. I spoke to a filmmaker, a very successful doc filmmaker, and she told me that once she had her first documentary out there, people started filling up her mailbox with all kinds of similar stories.
I'm sure.
And I would love for that to happen. I would love for somebody to say, well, if you liked that, maybe you should look into this and bring me another. But it was such a good, I'm not going to complain if I don't ever get another one, because this was, maybe this will end up being the peak, but I'm fine with that because it was a great ride.
I don't think so. I think you have an incredible talent as a storyteller, and then just to like how you are so empathetic to these characters. I think you have a really good like vision, and I think that this is not the peak. I think if you want to, you can continue making incredible documentaries like this or narrative work.
I definitely resonate with Brett feeling a little bit haunted and unresolved. Like, this is going to be a hard one to let go. It's going to live rent free in my head for the rest of my life, for sure.
You can always make a part 2 to the documentary.
I know, right? I've already had more people come forward with more stuff, and I'm like, I guess I'll just have to put little things on YouTube.
It's the docu-series.
Yeah, I could. Yeah, I'll just never finish the movie. I'll just keep making the movie forever.
Yeah.
Well, this is Queer Cinema Catchup, the podcast where we talk about movies, TV, and miscellaneous topics through a queer lens, and also occasionally interview incredible filmmakers like Elijah Sullivan and his wonderful documentary, The Whole Story. And I think we'll have to follow up when the movie gets released on streaming.
We highly recommend. I know we talked about it quite in depth on the podcast, so you may feel like I've
seen the whole thing.
But I think you need to kind of experience it for yourself and watch it. You won't be disappointed.